Kaya ay matan waya sa pamamahay datu and kapkasa kirakan rakting sandakan na agenda na kauna kata. Area pwede essential dengan kasarawitan katakot may sa mga rawat apan katrok nindang iman kiyang ay kimal sa karatan wow. Iyang kung sa ko and pompe kung paunigay iso ko tukan nanadangkan dan kaniyaitan berkat dan sa pamamar program and may sa mga Corporato was accept even paunigay Toror Kapinan Pompe Honorable Reed Holbert Cabinet Paris Ibilman Kuligi Wawat Isonangan and Wainu Bewuya Public Auditor Ostapakan Paris Isang Public Auditor Wawduro ang Director Peter Long Wasay Sagos Ostapakan Paris Portman Paris Ibigman Waunigi Pro Mayor Sagos, the Assistant Attorney General Judicial. Waunigi Tiray Logo Karas Me Yang Parparome Tapay Yang Radio Silay Saman Ranawat. Arya Kuyan Rujunata Katawag ay ko na low yung wendak sa wasa kaway ko kamarain ay sa umawat iman dugay yung one baron max na din
malaking kupuret ng katuta. O kumain pakai cakar-kawat low nan kupur. Ay bang katuan san kapag kain kapag. Wow lah. Ang kami main court. Pwede ansyo mapinir kasi mo item. Main court labalap. Ir magating kapkatar lang utangka. Autokarakan korus. Oh iya, kik caput mami. Tuan tatawagan department wat. Bebas patut dia pang kurang main kot labalap. Paten. Iral kiti kan mepinir keting kupurek dia. En kawai program wat. Semen kasar witang kami main kot labalap program wat. Mepinir keting kucana dia. En kapuitan ang marahin dengan ang rangot. Main kot labalap. Ir maging kating kalwa wi me korus ni chamba. Semen wong tiang kami. O kating tiang kami. Pasandikan mapuitar. Changren karakter. En kamtaan sa kosan tika sambal wat main kot labalap sebab petikan so depan pisang kapan kawi en sabal mangai sarau ong railkan makan usewi kosan tika sambalkan ong department wat uang di korus depan ala kawi kong kading kupuran o kasarawila na korus sang nisabing programot laun sakla naman at code o sabon mong yeres o ngayon saraw amen.
Kailangan ko mo one baron Arian subset Masan and Pasong o iban patungan dugay ang Director Wasay Pinanong.
Kailangan MC mulai bang patrowan mana itumal sekarang kosong iman jian tu ya itumal sekarang wow sansan itumal sekarang wow apa biaya mau kuantakan apa kamu rai sobai di konfiu itumal sekarang wow pantok dengan watch jian ti sekarang wow pan kurang sekarang ini besonu nawiya pakto Itumal sekarang wow kan, na wow nanti boleh belajar, right? Cabinet officers kan bayan tay, bayar Mr. Kamata, we are the director. Dan wow nanti right chairman and board silu mapatukan, menentukan bangsa. Ayan, sama tayo terpenelamat dengan wow the board members and chorus staff, wow Toror, and we extend our welcome to Mr. Town President, who has been with us since the transition period, since the territory times, through the transition period until now. I would call him a citizen of Colombia, and he is very instrumental in putting together the code of Colombia State. Dengan wawupi Marusia yang pada sebaca, dengan tiang kemanas kapeng mana lumirail kan, ketika benar kubur mau kuburan sawas, buka arayam sama dengan benar ranu ada poin tahun itu yang penting. When sawas saya tak saya Science Department was Mayoral Executive, so the Toronto cut and said, I am a Garata Persawas Piawi or Mayoral, Captain Mayoral, Boros, look at guitar, Foreign Sawas, or Science and Macari, Samuel Cosantirano. Bilman Kapataya Mate, once upon a while, and all the San Mateo Principal Church. Look at the child, look at Science. Ya, ukutan dia berkusunatan lebih sahab, contoh isian kaluat dia ilang kami. Unian sebab pun di tahu pasal dia kan kasawasap, sansan memolang hubungan sahab, sulit tosan kirakan lebih dia bangsa. Ayat negara tak belum punya principal church, ini kan patriark, dia kan tahu kan di tuan tanah sansan. Ini kawasan dia kan tahu kan dia. Dahil kagan paligan iyo benar om uya bersah, anggagan mari patuan uya bermusunatakan o kakelaga kusunat mintuan tamal kusunat. Beberapa orang tahu panjang sawas yang agak cisawus berbol uya menbuat, ada yang kayu tapi itu, o yang kamu itu tu kusunatakan kusunatnya dan bermadai ko kusunatan ko. Ayat negara terambat ini lagi, waktu mendengayan puratai, komen tapi, ansur sebab yang saya dari kata mulia kerana, amin kita, saya korus board members kan staff, nataan dia, kiran kerana bagi bahan parata, nangai cuan, mata-mata, aku dari lilipian antara buku, ansur murun specific issues, ayat bahan tu kayan, kam, boleh berisi boleh Porque answer was a fun. Ranwat special attention women we are Katun Meral on Salmatai auditor. They Salmatai Isnagan Waisonu. And creation science that we are auditing with Toka Tokaman with Toko Sisa. Unan Bukagalan Kusunatin Sab, Bukadala Kusunato, Kasawata Kapukaga Mugana Banarin. Kedua ini sab, riap, nagray ba kami kagarabuhay kung sarawi, sab siyang doon na Kaurat tayo sab, ina kawasan ng numero, sab, nawiya kawasan ng Salmatel Diaz, kitang bayan uwi, ito ako lang karoon sa amin sab. Pero maabuan pa ba ang sab po mo sa kanakan, ay kagarabuhay kung natatawa karoon sa kanakan. Ay magkakaroon ng tayo na ganun. Yamin na kayo sa iyo, asal ya kayo, paano ya kanon din na kay ukit sa rumah do da kan andak ka tumay luya kan kesulut kan punta o ka tumi ko kan usal ofisa. Ay mat ne men GNP o prega prega mention ka sila main ko o ka ka na sa pala usal.
Kailangan kurang wasay sa was. Amen. Mawai menagis kato sa uktar gratification bis media nan hajenta wasa me special remark o keynote address. Uktar lawet sabun atay kapnan wain pombe honorable Reid Holger dan we have special remark o pwede katawag pasanta sa sabad man iso nan kan katawag ang sodo sa wala ye iso nan kan kan we have keynote address kaya iso what manuali anti paros o dugaya nan sakaratan sawas o imen duga Honorable Governor Reid Holger and so
kailangan ko promoy one para si sungal sa karatan wow kakatatat kadang sa karatan wow kan lakoy ko tar mo si sungal wow lat kan kupran sinagan no uya sa bulmen tunpe kadang uya sa bulmen tunpe accounting auditing office wow when dito ba director of sinsa pasay so guys nanat nanawa sugong naisao direkan ng langgan nagkat wasaksit may isang rado wow joro rin bigtaga uliatan Attorney General's Office Grove wawan bigtaga Chairman in Port Silu yang katang tatawag ni isang Ronwood Ijuan wow joro rin bigtaga director ka Office kan Coros Media Mission Ronwood. Special recognition to good friend, Legal Counsel of Legislature for so many years, Mr. Tom Tegman. My respect to you this morning. Ijuan wow kan kubur Coros Telkan me. Kachpene tapat pene. Nelen Mission Ronwood kan kubur niso. O nelen kanisa. Wow and dito be. Suntok minsa. Mr. Litor, Rekan Korusian, Kachan, Eubenation Run. Moa Ijual Katan Dan Kubraniso, Melon Director, Wasai, Obil, MC Mason Ranwood, Nani Patroman Sabunatay, Program in Ranwood, Nagasanedi, Kabina, Jumalangi, Keynote Speaker, Ayapil Patroman Tame, Isop, Pilkan Nasin. Masabi bil ebis karay tay patrol lang wagi kayo keynote speaker again dan oyang the patroyang iray kan din semen nan oralaben tame tangkin polita ket kapran ranwot yeyi sa regional wewe nan kanisa may iban patrowan Lewis and Clark may lausang sa bulutay ko iso dalam kayu konen rawat cakap san kan kubur kerjau sabul macam kosantin wawun kunti iso le kamu ternasen tan tebuluput sojo ne ko cakap pitawan lam o ebiltan mungsuti yang satai kernan kunti yang patro ngurin nasen ini rin nan saun waning chok tuan koros ipatawan kamelele o ininin katungi pagik try kecintaan nasa ni workshop ong board member kan ong chon the talking sa the ong kitay koros may ipatawan bil kamelele magay devin 14 shop kaleb anane training the workshop board and office koros nan sabon matay government anane sabon training bukas o ibilimen kapindiyan director o chon the talking of sisap because maybe workshop bukas and yawi run with wala ipatawan bil sabon matay anan chocho me bananane kamaula nan tatok enapali sabon matay sa Meron na binsan sa nila moni tungkol sa karata na muna ramas ay isap na niyo. Isap kinuya iragos ang value ng kamangay kapoy pentato o wasakos. E biluya yung ira na bilkayo katungtun kung choy santa ko. Ibil kamera na bilboy sarawiyo Israel del ranwot sa piluya katungtun law del ranwot. Area ng workshop in Ranwo to lakap. Ipaduan kami element, irekan metan, sumalim kita. Ayon sa uwan kap, sa wase sa drive board, o chondo dapat of shop. Kanbiya sa wase kayo uwan kap, kalwa, sa bulmatay fuko. Nilagin ko sanya, sa bulmatay fuko, sa bulmatay office. O irajaykan, magtay ka din mga may pasan-tasang ananatin, kutsong palitin. Sa kung kitay, min kunti dengan yiyasti o nilimanti sab na kusyang pala kita and so forth. Ijungal kapin sa katabatong director was ISO case pergi irakan sa was kontak. Ewang tatakin minsan ranwood kontak santi. O ikan kajon ulian diop singkap na uya sa on momotan. O biluya jungal kasang kapin o kajoan me. Wishing you all a very successful workshop. Kung nabiye, sa wash tour, may sa kapatun niya, ay kaparapar ko, may staff kan katin, o at mga lobbies kan katin. Ay imet, may kan katin ulian di, sa kulmay, obviously ka na uwiat, sa karatan, sa narangol, sa karata kapadapat, kapin, o wakan, kurun ko. Kalalan yung tigur ko.
Area na essential na nachenta niya wasabis me kung nabata me speaker and Bombay legislature Honorable Martin Yamaguchi kanang katawang rano kaya pwede sketch ko la waktak legislature kan patoyong nan wira manang ranwat ay makareta akan serokakan katong kay may sama rango. Ang sawiyo muri sa was talakap mapantak patro mapantak. Area kapanong meron ang sa umawat Thailand bukayang tinog-tiga. Area essential nan kami essential nan screen me inanan kapat-kapat meron sakit me isonan ganinu sabat sabon man ma sakitin sombeyo ma metal capability sabon me isonan ganinu sakit area engkak sansal me keynote speaker trawatar port proto ang sobatala Well, commission toto ay so kadala. Katen yang sawan man kita kaya toto may yang aking capacity building workshop. Every science menan target tuwak kunin sa puno lalato ramot sombar de may sa kuwanaw. Sa waliman iso na ang ganinu. Sawas ang city government. Sawas ang Abasam national government. Sawas ang Bombay state government. May nananla. Ariya ay saw, ranew, surabahan ka ganitra. Yan kapag sa iratukan. Ewew, pukok. Ariya ni ralap. Sawas pukat. Esansal ng kaliang kamaray. Sawas pukat. Esansal ng kaliang kaitan bayan way. Epiluyayer sound kaway. Ang kaliang muni and Abasam national government. Epiluyayer sound kaway. Ang Abasam president. Epiluyayer sound kaway. Ang option governor. Na naisaw yung magpatala. Pilwiyas sound kaway and compact of free association plebiscite ng par kitwag kuwaling saksilu ranwat ewiya Bombay State Auditor ranwat ewiya Senior 1 Paran and Mumutson Cross o ansaw yung padala kaitiyang uko and kak apali malaylay panabak ang puwa aramasen waynu ang sama ay so mawat dahil way lang honorable iso ilan Joseph ay sabulman kita iso and kap ay sabul kapul sabulma keynote address iso
kailangan ng MC Wasari Sukes at ng Purley Nanawanet Kaliapan Office ng Attorney General Supplementary Legislative Council Mayor Director kan Members in Port Silu at ang Pumasay Open met juga yang cai koros me, pacoran wot, man, ukuran kawan ukot, dan itu wot sakit. Numerat kerana mai pan kosai, numerat, rambut musim. Kue kehiran nak cai kecikiti, itu wana sansar sang, kosai. Ini kesempat. Area kemal muid yang ia kan orang lapce. Ranwat patroan yang ay siyon kaway piyaman yakma Mrs. Alice bawiya utupan karakter and education at ton piyagamun yui in bawiya ekmal siyon kaway o dunia serbenin Pilipin man umorakan akir karamay tamaw in bawiya siya pumatay senior auditor ng OPSI. When sabyata, OPSI public auditor. Kakautasan ni Article ACKEW, Section 1 and supplementary pasan ng OPSI. Panmiyat public auditor man ong ng state of God. Office what iya po ko kayo kasampan utapan support accountability or transparency in the public sector. We're working on Bombay state government. O bon ka sansat po kita lang sote mo mami na patron. Puko. Office what tunganan ki manaman. Troso. Niya yung yaw makabla po sa kuman. Weki dito na yung public auditor ikak subina. Shorten the Philippine and then sangat na speaker chief justice. Public servant correspondent Bombay ma ipanan na information at malap siya sa wasita. Umakmay siya ba ang kapayata? Ipil ka kumain ng J. Kung yan sabi mami na naman kasi. speaker short, hey, o outro con sansa dan chorus. Short reporter and governor, short reporter and speaker, reporter and chief justice, the reporter and court. Short. O question that kasarete me, utan pa outro independent. Payen ka kuya o kapayata etol puko, papa on way, the melon o pum. Niya iso ke bang berke me bangkat baca kabna masan di fire. Hey, legislator mak chat mak kakombalaya tu mak itipat. May bangkat. What term sumbar pai. Watakala the framers of our constitution. Where we roto metai. We'll consolidate the Makasota pan, Patok pan, and we let the influence decision. You have to be independent. Utor, Yam Patok, Salata, Wonu. Second, the dog sang the bill, Cosantin, Cosilata, Kayu, Constitution of Kasota. Kusunod ng buwan kung pa'y kagawda nan paan kusunod din SM ano ka dari kusunod yun buhay banta tayo kusunod to kagayim siya lang kusunod to kamanamay siyang kapna-orfer ng September party o tama kusunod to ya kawawa news of transparency, o puko, o utoran ups. Sangli, apa pukat, second kontabat, second tawi moment tatok, sang mana-mana kusin na mapongya, kamelet kumayawi tatok, nintuan ko something kusin na kan, pungan kusin na kan. Song sidu, bapasa na tatok, the 3 E6 on the performance budget, or even in financial performance auditing on financial audit. 3 ECO, sinabi niya rin mo, the efficiency, the effectiveness, and the economy. Sang niya pagpukat, because of native, so para sa malar, Kapoy kisya, nintuan masalin kapna, wasay, ukchay korosmangi. Ipawasanin sa pulmatan, yeyas pun kisya. Kuy kupatapato, siya biyaya. Namasyo. Etin tatokin audit masawiya, bepitata department of pun, sangni, ibitian office work way back in early 1980s. Kita berbagi riado di situ. Wegi kesimpulan siap penggaya ramasan, gaya kenai riai kan, ramasan tunpi kenai cikicik kenai lap pokok. Kawasan ini sama macam dia sih. So, etin aku ya audit yang nekabuta lulus ke Bid Department of. Second kalau pola Wakata kira masa betul makona answer what we are. Because Mapalian help Department of Health, Sabang Kola, Sabang Kilang, fix up, eat, tolang nan, medical, tolang nan, some sophisticated. Again, pagkinapat, ay sito mga isang pagkanaja Department of Health. Rimag-aral dakat nan Riyapit na not-audit plan siya kasalit mo sa kancap kita siya. O sa tiyarata, siyang toto mechanic, strength, sa tiyarata, siyang toto mauta luwat, with division ng management and SAP ng purpose. O yet, audit report kung tumayin mo mo yung supplement the document. Say issue it to waiting. Yamanagap, Lantuan Managapo, even though we are acting director of land, Mon Katian Wasai, and we are the director. Isi yang cuaran report kawat apa? Komite director, kapina nano, uyu, berita tahu pun sudah. Ini kesampan mailen yang wangi kepacuan, tangan setiap. Uang bersotro misal, rima, uang kacang ni orang lap sekarang orang pengayu. Yang contoh tangkan kami tiada kayu setiara kami kau nepen kau itu department co ini dua oh penyasa orang seperti tiara kami kar pendia berterak-terak nang yang ke mana-mana and apali Division silu macam tiada kami mengenai Division of Public Land. Paco pan portiu, porto nan ke mana manusia, enapali Division Public Land. Nilai dan wait pokoknya pont bay ini bang. Oh biar cuma. Seperti tiada kami punya Division of Historic Preservation. Pilih Board of Trust. Iran में supplement के चुनाव के आपवाली शाम और इसमें board जो चल रही है, ये किसी में शुरू करता था। आरबी कान पर तरफ करना है। वो सेपल किया रहता है Division of Survey and Map. वो की शाम से आपको हुआ था। Pilih Regulatory Report on Division. और अलग को किसी या शाम Port silu parliament appointment director sama. Director social channel ke mana manusia. Negara itu setiap tahun port in public land jemenian. Asyik boleh. Saya nak report nama setiap. A port in historic preservation premier. Mia considered on acting or porting survey and mapping shorter creation part of the window they said and the division of the sort of function will be short of port and pushing the port of the bank in my opinion women administrative services support the bank port of the bank shorter supplement director pasayan ita administrative ay kakarata seucar pukat kayon pantangin duwatin management omni appointment division focus luo pweki shorter supplement shorter rights one mana nukan pweki post kamu Sebil tolo bilja kusinat makawata port bukan isang kokoros apa kokoros. Bilnya ya ada isang loopholes. O penna in melod kabna kokoros. Siapa ka grade yang mau karakter tanan nanti yang tertawa sudah nanti. Pakan pakan. Isang kokoros san nak sama report bisa kau kita isi. Ya, siapa isi? Even by the lecture mongle. Oh, Omata the Pitmo, a short young man, objecting with art to the top. And I not think here where it came to my attention during our art. Very yet, recommendation may be a kapna, the token Department of Land. Na shorter ka door of pelle port the top part port tell you I'm challenging governor challenging decision making. Water tayo naman po ko chorus, director pamilya, administrative support staff and po. Jawa kaka limit, jawa kaka isimen, kaka riya. As a non-legal person, administratively about kamangay na tao. So it's a challenge to give you a legislative process. Where kaya tapukat administration department ka po may posiya. Ay so to siya consultant. Kayo now isa pinagdiyarata lack of communication internally within the department and externally with irailakan na piniyam sa pukong department. Nagarasap rekrutan muna. Rekrutan public land places on commercial. Where we essential residential zone. Commercial lease na kung pa asya masyadiyata 136 136 ng colonial lerwasa. Something to talk of loopholes, total bilala. Sort of coordination, for example, nintuan, regretan, lease ko, ng Department of Land, o Department of Treasury, Appellate, Palian Revenue and Taxation, Pukoki. Notice, Pukoki. Magkaradan, duwat mo, siya niyaradan, one public lease, the sort of quick commercial lease. Areas, patronly, video may won't see. Answer what's use up. Quickly, arrive commercial lease kan. Pero nanti harus ko pa. Dito mo pasan dia. Filmnya kasanti kay ba? Fighting ng besilu, ang siya tiyatama. Kami utan insurance on lease. Dari may rent lease yung sa kapain. Ako kasan ito ba? Department of Law kapain rampan. Makato siya kataga. So ito may yung yaw. Ay, isiba po okay. Sansat nan kasan na kasi. Kunan dalil masari isang pukat. Kita nagkak biarat sa mapan dia manaman. Ong nipalian kasan diyan work policy, work procedure, apekan chorus. Pinanalo kan change niya pangkak updated, pangkak conform with the realities of today. Jabin tiara taman commercial lease kan niyaso mga primary BC o niyaso kan patrowan reader and tatong kay Edward was only pan commercial. Utang pan niya isa ko kan jiyo pan niya consent sa public na. Boom. Para sa siyang. So do we have being a personal observation, major DC. Governor Bodega, please don't get patient delegate. Kasi nung kita ba, yawon na ta, o kayo utama. O ito bigyan. Kalilaw, public land, authority, etc. Amin. Bigyan niya yung sinito. O, nahanap na updated our governmental recommendation. Kasanod na utang papilan the department na kami strict site that is valid only commercial lease. So to be yung job ang so kariyawo. So kariyawo to be where utano pasyo par siludumaw, that's the best likat biya yarata na I can think back. Wiki, ako lang totoo puwasi. Hindi ako sa pariya. Nasa pariya ko, sunod ako siya. Kukuha natin siya. Pagkira na only quit claim on residential leases way behind. Documentation that even in social charge non-department of Niyat Gintato siyang tayo kasi confirm na wiyawi mau eso kayo physical evidence jalan nan kong director kung pampain ka stores karasat tawi purchase order kasi wiyawi ka purchase order wiyawi tuan procurement regulation na pero so dapat ko kasi Oy mana sansa kami naman communication of the Guidance Department of that. What's your chorus rako? Woman physical dia ka bisa bawa ayam mo. Dan sto sa siya. Simak dia. Dia nang kapan physical. Kerja documentary. Sto siya sa dia processing question nan kasi din siya ko chorus. Kaya taken from the department plan. Government को से पिल्लन legislature judicial division है. ताम messages is component में. Supporting them. Physical के यो कहलाई documentary. वो दास कांगरा ओके jalan नन्नो बोला बियर दातन को बोला ताऊ युद्ध. Masuk second question. Follow we can be a policy procedure. Residual analysis. Based on Thomas Carter, with or without second Kenya analysis, o kapayo, yawa analysis. We work oral. Kasi tiada kapayo dah luar pun. Filipin tiada dah melihat contoh tahu mesyuarat maaf kita perantia bosok. Akan kasih ada yang melakukan mesyuarat melayan dan kami tak kaya ada jadi bosok. Kami biar birodium. Rimu magayu dua kali sedangkan tiada mungkin. Meriam wo physical kotak mana. Onan department tu sampai tu like minute and meeting in order. Minute and meeting take, incoming communication, outgoing. Sebagian kian kumai chances kumai dan group nan your files are uniya se umber utan fensa dan mesota. That's when you find yala. Weki tamak kumai puyu ya. Ira yung mapitna ko niya se umber bantu aramas. Nenda masyarakat, bila na natin document to put in the file when come protect and what reaffirm the decision come kupurkan something. Yung shooting trip. Oka puna, pag jajan kami papai. Kaya din po. Of course, the police state government na also. Then natin supporting. Mereka kamera yang berbiaya. Government sign management officer review some also come also. When we are allowed TV ka patrol apa po. Yang kan saya bilang iman ka pimpinan. When bisa sel kapina audit what Reno kita ni responsible berapa sekarang dia apel kari om cipta. O kayo na audit. Nan sempat research by perpatuloy nan pagkakaya mo will be official. Undan response coming from the director, they just coming from survey and mapping. Very comprehensive. O ikosa nitin ba, kung murisyon pa riyaw silu, asabang purala. Kung isang salan. Sabang purala o follow-up findings. Kami, kumain kacin wiwiya. Ito na kumain no kita, kumain no kita kumain kasyo. Wiya-wiya mo, tanggiyaw, tanggiyaw, wangka kaya. Ngayon, tumami, resolution about the findings po. Finding ko sa katidyang na report ka, i-uranapin. Bercakap-cakap seperti itu. O finding ko sa katidyang na utang kesampal kemahiran take action. O sabun macam ko sinat ko sa itu ba. Action utang pang wiyaw. Bahasa saya yang public auditor. Suatu pang kau ni syukari. Short agency department. Nanaran naman suatu pang take action kemahiran kapumala kami biar ko. Problem ko mandi biar ko. O ini kan bisa. Dan gambaran sa paggawa ko sa recommend finding recommend message ya ulo. Apa ko yang kalkal mo dito it's a risk to the economy, efficiency, effectiveness. As long as you do so. Karibi man kapnagi karakter, where the department, the audit team, major Rangwood, keeping focus of the public auditor updated. Tama kumain kasi no previous yung pagkira sumu sa mala magkakuya, ang kapumala, kakela ka sa pumatay pagka-witness. Department, NWS. Kaya may mag-aaral na kailangan kasi kailangan may watch ka. Sabon mo mga naman sa mga ito, kita na kasi po, baka sabi na alas pero ng nandiyan, i-repay mo ito na sosyahan siya. May kasi rin, isang kapatuan, isang pagkiyaw na ka. Siya po ito, hotel, kahit din siya kapagit ko. Kahit din the purpose of art, Saya punya author kuih nan kusin natin Amerika kuih the premium makinala chala isi ba kota utara na subject to audit hari dautin sawas mo India federal million thousand rupees thousand ima ka kaya to kota top na situal kam ka kaya ta pero kaya ka port karena clearing house boy kabila ko para ko wasa yoranda we make up share with us. Again, I want to emphasize this. I take in Kumalkin something. Safety my mom is a facility sa kanto. Tawla, uwiya, and siya kapiyata COVID-19. Morinel sa Tawla, uwiya, education. Oh, I'm still debating with my advisors. Support staff for the show. We cannot complete too much. Now, I'm still hoping that we can do it, but I'm confident, especially to make the responsibilities mostly compliance. Some material annual financial audit falls under the single audit requirement under the company, where US gave us $500,000 a year. The challenge of the central government $1 million a year, para da puede be amonio na child delegated responsibility in contact of single financial audit o national public audit. Ang kuwan medyo US ang word. Congress na atuwa sa akin. Buwan siya siya kapitan. Irong question single audit o ko tataw yan lawan. How you live money? O diya ka sa so that's the matter. Ang politics lagi yang dia melakukan konstitusi kaki. Kailangan ng gabda, kailangan ng masay, kailangan ng guru, kailangan ng korupsi.
Kailangan ng iso ang nasa ng kawin. Kaya ako na ay sa office kaya pray mo yung minute dumawin maanika gimet makaya kalipay yung may isang word so may tayo ka puto na kaya paano ko yung presenters ko kaya pray ang focus kung nabataan ko ito atak niya kailangan ng rado ko may sakas kita and at this time to move on to our first presentation. As we can see on the screen, and to be brief, as all of us here today know that Mr. Tom Nicholas is the legal counsel for Bombay State Legislature. It is true, Mr. Tom Beckman came to Bombay as a Peace Corps volunteer straight out of law school in 1973 at the age of 43. Very young. Mr. Tom Beckman, the people of Bombay have recognized your long public service career that has devoted to the people of Bombay through Bombay Legislature. Today, the people of Bombay are also realized that if not all, then much of all land legislations has come from your band. So at this time, to answer to all concerned with land matters, I now invite Attorney Tom Beckman for his presentations.
Good morning, everybody. Is it working? Yes. With the permission of our moderator, our good moderator, I ask your permission to address you in the native language of the state of Virginia instead of the state of Bombay. So I ask your indulgence in that respect. I'd like to begin my remarks with paying my respects to the traditional leaders, the governor, the elected leaders, national, state, and local, our cabinet members, our state auditor, all of you, ladies and gentlemen, are so involved in land law for the state of Bombay. When I first came to Bombay in 1973, they told me that land is the most important aspect of the culture and traditions of Bombay. With everybody here today, that's witness of that fact. To begin my remarks, I'd like to start in Land Law 101 in my law school. Our land professor got up and he said, the creation and development in land law, 100 years is like one day in the creation and the development of the law. And what he was referring to is that land law is as old as civilization itself. Civilization started when man discovered how to cultivate the land. And the cultivation of land would not work unless the community respected the farmers and their farmers' relationship to the land. Now, we have anthropologists here today who could track the land law of land in Pohnpei all the way back to the creation of Pohnpei itself. We've gone also through the colonial periods of the Spanish, the Germans, the Japanese, the Americans. We all know about the German deed laws and such like that. I will leave that to the experts in the history of in anthropology of Pohnpei. I'd like to start my talk when I first came to Pohnpei in 1973. At that time, we were a trust territory. You all remember those days. I was straight out of law school. I was recruited as an attorney, a peace corps attorney, but in the early days of the trust territory, there were only a handful of attorneys throughout the entire trust territory. So I was assigned a double duty of working both with the district legislature here in Pohnpei and also with the trust territory in Congress up in Saipan. So I had a dual role. And when I first came to Pohnpei, Micronesia was in a crisis. The crisis was about land. The United States was working with the Northern Marianas to take the Northern Marianas out of the trust territory and create a separate commonwealth. My work with the CT Congress, this was very, very disturbing because it was breaking the unity of Micronesia. We were working for a new government that would encompass all of Micronesia. The Northern Marianas was the most developed. The Marshalls had Kwajalein. At that time, Palau was entertaining a super port for oil tankers. All of those districts would bring in the resources to make Micronesia a viable country, a viable nation. And the separation of the Northern Marianas marked the end of unity. Why was land such an issue? Inherited from the Japanese times into the American times, all the public lands were held by the central government in Saipan. If you were going to look to the emergence of government by Micronesians for Micronesia, that would mean that the land would pass to the Congress of Micronesia. That couldn't happen for the Northern Marianas because most of the Northern Mariana Islands, the northern islands of Marianas, were all public lands. So, at the very beginning, the U.S. was attempting to segregate the lands of the Northern Marianas from the rest of Micronesia. And this is the source of what we call the Secretary Order 2969. We were all called to a conference by the United States in Honolulu, one of the hotels in Waikiki, in which the United States government announced its formal intention to separate the Northern Marianas and deal with them as a commonwealth. I was tasked by our early senators to help them make a presentation. And if we can go to slide 2, please. Not really knowing how to address this, I looked to a story from the Old Testament of the Bible. And I'm going to read this out because it's important. It's the Genesis story of a brother of Jacob and Esau, the brothers of Abraham. And it starts like this. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob then said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold him his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank, and rose and went his way. And thus Esau despised his birthright. Basically, he gave his birthright away. So, as we were approached by the American delegation, they were trying to justify why they wanted to break up the unity of Micronesia. And they offered a gift in return. Birthright. The birthright was, if you endorse the separation of the Northern Marianas, we will build unto you a capital. That has become palatable. But at the conference, even Beto Henry, Speaker of Congress at the time, took up the story of Esau, so I said, okay, I'm on the right page. And that was how my introduction to land happened. I'm drafting legislation and resolutions criticizing the United States for trying to split up the unity and such like that. But if you remember the story of Esau and Jacob, Jacob gets the inheritance. Jacob gets the promised land. Jacob has 12 sons. Here comes the birth of Israel. Late in the story, Esau comes back, and Jacob is very afraid, but Esau embraces his brother. And that's what happened in the conference. One of my last drafting assignments was to draft a resolution wishing the Northern Marianas Godspeed and success in the future. Now we have Secretary Order 29 returning the lands to Pohnpei. But there is a complication here. The United States had promised a new capital. That was their lentil stew. That was their red stew. That was the gift of the birthright. Pohnpei was the natural choice for the capital. More public land in Pohnpei than any other state in the FSF. By now, the Marshalls had split off, Palau had split off, and now we're down to 4 remaining through the Constitution of the Federated States. Now, some of you old-timers will recall the plebiscite when Micronesians were asked about what kind of relation they wanted to have with the United States in the post-trusteeship era. The rest of the FSM voted yes on free association. Pohnpei said no. So the United States was very sensitive about Pohnpei sentiments. We saw that in our negotiations on the comeback to free association, which is another subject. But with respect to land, their initial idea was they're going to return the land to all of the districts. First to the Northern Marianas, of course, because that was the purpose for the whole return of public land. Then to the other districts, Palau, Marshalls, all of the FSM. But in Pohnpei, they're going to make an exception. They wanted to withhold about 800 acres of land from the return to Pohnpei. The reason being, this is our pot of stew. we're going to make sure that you're going to get a new capital because we're going to reserve that land from our distribution to Pohnpei. So when I first came into Pohnpei in 1973, the real crisis was unity. Now the crisis is, are we going to be deprived of 800 acres of land because of the United States promise to build a capital? And this is the genesis of the Public Lands Trust. This is different than any other state in the FSM, any other district in the trust territory. Why does Pohnpei have a board of trustees? Why does Pohnpei have a public lands trust? This evolved from Pohnpei's reaction to 2969, which returned the lands to the districts to be decided by the district legislatures. Why the district legislatures? That was the only agency of government in trust territory at the time that was actually sourced by the people of the various districts. So self-government will give it to the legislatures. Most of the legislatures just dumped it on the administration, dumped it on the governor's office. Okay. But Pohnpei took a different approach. We didn't have a governor in 1975, 76, 77. We had a district administrator. The district administrator and all of his cabinet were appointed by the High Commissioner. The High Commissioner was appointed by the United States government. So if we gave the land back to the administration, the executive branch, in essence, we were giving it right back to the trust territory again. So an idea came to birth in the discussions in the legislature. We need to find a better approach. And we looked around and all the examples we could find. We even looked to Fiji. And we looked at Hawaii, the Hawaiian Native Land Trust, and the Fijian Native Land Trust. And we said, okay, we need to get the land away from the trust territory to make it truly Pohnpei. And to do that, we are going to create an entity totally separate from the district government. And that turned out to be the Public Lands Authority. We created an authority at that time that was independent of the state government. There were traditional leaders, local leaders, and such that were to serve on the board of directors of the authority. And that authority was the one that received the public lands from Saipan when it was deeded down. Now we get to the issue of the capital. We were going to get the lands in Pohnpei except for about 800 acres. The idea that they were going to build a Washington, D.C. on the shores of Pohnpei. That was not well received by the members of the legislature. Because they were thinking, if you have a city set up in the middle of Pohnpei, the National Constitution says the city, the capital, is outside of the control of the state. Any houses that are built there, any stores that are built within there, all that tax money would go straight to the national government. It would not be shared with the states because the capital is not part of Pohnpei. So, immediately, the leaders of Pohnpei, our founding fathers, went straight to Saipan and just, no, you can't do this. This is not right. The capital of the country should be accomplished through an invitation of the host state to bring the capital in. If you look at the history of Washington, D.C., it was made possible because the state of Maryland donated 10 square miles of land along the Potomac. It came from a state initiative to create the national capital. So our first job was to try to convince the Trust Territory, Department of Interior, you shouldn't be dictating where the capital should go. You shouldn't be dictating what the size of the capital will be or what its nature is. That is the essence of self-government. The people of Micronesia, the people of the Federated States, should be deciding this themselves. Now, because Pohnpei had distanced themselves from the concept of free association, the American side was sensitive to the feelings of the Pohnpei community. They didn't want to alienate the Pohnpei community any more than they already had. So they accepted that. All right, so you're going to give us 800 acres. I don't think so. We got it down to 400 acres, and then we got it down to 200 acres. And then, finally, in the last negotiations, we said, all right, up to 200 acres, but you need to justify every one of those acres. And this was being negotiated back and forth with the first board of trustees, the first board of directors from the Public Lands Authority, along with the legislature and the other policymakers in Pohnpei at the time. Now, when we get into the actual legislation, and I'm going to pull it down for you, the actual wording. Get it. I'm pulling this off of my computer, it's not up on the board.
Tom,
Yeah,
can I insert something? My part in that?
yeah. Use a microphone.
Directly related. Myself, Dr. Elwood Frederick, and Pedro Harris. We were at the FSM National Committee. So the first president, Tosmona Kayam, asked the three of us to, on behalf of the national government, work with the Board of Trustees. At that time, the Isanangan of Net was the acting commissioner. Nino Isanan. So our first meeting, we wanted to confirm because US said, here is $13, $14 million ready to build the FSM National Park. We knew that it was up to 200,000, just for you. So we set up a meeting. In our first meeting, I walked up. I got mad at Sanang. After that, we met. Dr. Frederick and Pedro Harris briefed me what happened. Lisa was adamant, not 200 acres. Second meeting we came, I walked out again, and I told the secretary, tell Lisa to come up, so I will fight. You're young, and because I knew then that 200 was kind of promise to house the FSM National. So we continue until the legislator made the final decision. And I was still mad, because I said, you know, we are promised 200, and yet we're drawing back. So 132 acres, right? That's the final, in the law. I just call it through. But you know, after that was what the law excluded: no embassy road, no whatever you got, only, even presidential, the law, you will review it. But I just want to share with you, being young, and I thought I knew everything, but I am very, very grateful, because that was what the decision made by John Anken, recommendation to legislature and passage. It's a plus for the state. We wanted at that time negotiated, they would even build homes for cabinet members, the president, the speaker, the chief justice, and what have you, on the capital side. The final outcome, they passed it, I think it's going to share with you. And then I finally realized the economic benefit of not building rental homes for national government versus international government. So that's what happened. So please proceed.
Thank you. This didn't happen overnight. This was a long, long, drawn-out process. Now, the land was deeded to the national government, not to exceed 200 acres. But there was a very important proviso, and this is in the law, 42 PC 10-101, subsection 1, paragraph F. If after 5 years following the date of transfer, it be found that active use has not commenced, there has been a cessation of active use for that segment of transfer and any improvements thereon not actively used, those lands are to revert back to the public lands trust. Now, if you quiz any member of the national government today and ask them if they feel an obligation to return any of their unused lands, the Board of Trustees, time and time again, have asked the national government to cooperate on that. Not very successful. But the deed of trust was made, the conveyance was made based on what they represented that they would need. Now, when the negotiations were going on, they had floating ponds and reflecting ponds and all kinds of parklands and such like that in order to spread out the size of the capital, to get as much of that 200 acres as possible. Not, if you were in the national government, you've been doing the same thing, maximizing your conveyance. He said, okay, go ahead and be creative, go as far as you can, but if these are just pipe dreams and they never materialize, then bring the land back to the public land, back to the public land trust. And that's where we stop with slide 1. Let's go to slide 2. All right. I was talking with Acting AG a few minutes ago. My talk will just be going through the 200 pages or so of land law. Land law is probably the biggest and most active part of our code. It's amended more frequently than any other aspect. So I'm just going to switch across the top, and then our presenters will get into the nitty-gritty of leasing and conveyances and such like that. But just to finalize on the Board of Trustees, over time the law on the public lands evolved. The Public Lands Authority was dissolved, it was too expensive, it was brought down to the Board of Trustees, and the Department of Land Division of Public Land was then tasked with the responsibility to back up the board in their work. So we were economizing, and that's how we got to the point where we are today. All right, now for slide 2, we're going to go to a subject called the Promised Land. According to the Bible again. Not because the Bible is the source, but because, like I said, 100 years is like a day in the evolution of land law. And we're reaching back. All of our concepts of land come from basic fundamental aspects of how conveyances of people relate to their land. And we know from the Bible, the Promised Land was central to the birth of the Israeli nation. I will plant them on their land, and they shall never again be uprooted out of the land that I have given them. Thus saith the Lord. Amos 9:15. Let's backtrack again to 1973. At that time, the trust territory had what they call a homesteading program. Kozo Yamada upon Payne was the head of land matters for the trust territory at the time. Frankie Castro was the senior land commissioner for Punta. Those were the leaders in land at the time. The homesteading program was there. I worked on it in Saipan, where it was fairly well developed. But Saipan was the headquarters of the trust territory, and all the government was there. 1973, the road didn't get past Awa, didn't get past Bailey Altars Hotel going the other way. Our homesteading program didn't materialize because we just didn't have the resources to make it work. So one of the first jobs of the district legislature is, how do we get these lands to the people themselves? Okay? First of all, we dealt with the then and now of 1973. We granted the Board of Trustees the power to make new leases, so we could start distributing land out. So we have Chapter 2 of Title 42, which is a general law on how lands are leased. And essentially, an area of land is assigned by law of the legislature. That is designated for agriculture, commercial, residential uses. The Public Lands Authority, Board of Trustees, with the help of the Division of Public Lands, divides up that land and then starts issuing out leases for the land. There's advertising and all kinds of due process and transparency that's involved in that process. To bring it up to date, the most recent designation of land, just in the last year, or the last couple of months, the legislature passed and the governor signed into a law the conversion of what we call the fixed retention lands, the old TT housing for the expat teachers and the surrounding area, are now being designated for the Board of Trustees to divide that land up and make it available for lease, whether it's commercial or residential and such like that. So that aspect of the Board of Trustees is an ongoing activity. Every year we open up, or every several years or whatever, we'll open up a new area for leasing. But then, in 73, like I was saying, the road didn't get very far, and communications to the south side of the island was pretty harsh. Well, we knew that from Japanese and Navy times, there were leases of these lands. And the desire of a family is not to lease land. The desire of a family is to own land. So the first step was to take what we call the Navy and Japanese leaseholds, the ones that there were records of with the Planetary Land Commission, and to make those available to convert from a lease to actual ownership. And that was done first with the Navy and Japanese leaseholds, because those are the ones that were, had the best documentation. Those who were holding Japanese leases were allowed 5 acres of land. Those who were holding Navy leases were allowed 3 acres of land. There was a caveat though, because the legislature was concerned that land should be distributed to as many people as possible. So if you were a landowner already, and you had a Japanese or Navy lease, and that exceeded 5 acres or 3 acres, you wouldn't be able to get that land in your own name. You've already got too much land. Oh, that was the big thing. So you would be able to name somebody else. Well, it's your sons, your daughters, somebody close to you, to take that land as your beneficiary. And that's how the promised land became a reality. Chapter 2, we dealt with Navy and Japanese leaseholds, and then the legislature turned its attention to colonial town, the residential leases. And the same theory developed for getting title to your residential leases in colonial town and in the surrounding area. Initially, in the law that says you will get your title after you pay up all your back rents. But the auditor will tell you the collection of rents is not that, not that thorough or whatever. And most all Pohnpeians were way behind in their lease payments if ever. And the lease payments were only $20, $30 a year, but after 20 or 30 years, that big tax up. So that requirement that you had to be up to date in your lease payments was quickly taken out of the law. They needed to be re-elected. But the other criteria for all of these lease to land conversion, for property ownership conversion, depended on continuous, constant possession and development of the land. A piece of paper was not enough. You had to show that you had built a house there, that you were planting crops. You had to do it continually, your father, your grandfather, and such like that. And then the last one, chapter 4A, we had what I call the Christmas gift. It was passed by the legislature in the 1980s, a couple days before Christmas. It wasn't signed by the governor until the 25th of January thereafter, but chapter 4A made a very substantial leap forward. They said, back in trust territory times, in the early times when we couldn't get very much farther out from Colonia down than the road would let us, the homesteading program didn't work. And people had to have places to live. So they moved on the land. They just moved on the land. They got Grand Marquis's permission or the section leader's permission or whatever. But there was no paper record. So the legislature grappled with that and they said, they need the land just as much as those who actually got their Navy papers or the Japanese papers. And then new provision was added in chapter 4A. If you can show you have lived on the land since the birth of the state government, that is the effective date of the Pohnpei Constitution, which was in 1984. If you can trace your ownership of land, your possession, not ownership, but if you actually lived on that land in 1984, you and your children, your grandchildren have continuously lived on that land. You treated it as your own. You developed it, you planted your crops, you built your houses. We will say you have a lease. The law would presume that if you have that land for all that time, you would be in the same shoes as somebody who got a Japanese or Navy lease. All right. So that finishes our chapter on how people got their promised land, okay? But there was one more step that we need to deal with, and that is chapter 6 of Title 4. Title 4 is the judiciary. During trust territory times, we had the land commission. We had Frankie Castro as the chairman of the land commissioner. We had several Philippines who were land commissioners as well. They were quasi-judges. They weren't called judges, they were called commissioners, and they made administrative decisions that would be referred to the High Court when Judicial was working with the High Court. So, all of these chapters that would convey land from the Board of Trustees to the individuals, the property owners, had to show that the land was not utilized for any other purpose, it was not legally committed to any other person or anything like that. There needed to be a legal determination that that leaseholder is entitled to receive title. And the job of the land court, and it's varied through all of these statutes, it's embedded in all of these statutes. When you get to the final process of awarding the deed, the Court of Land Tenure clears the way. It says, all right, you're going to get the deed and here it is. Now, file it, okay? So the last chapter in the Promised Land movement is our Court of Land Tenure. We took the Land Commission as the base of how that Court of Land Tenure would be structured. But we put it under the state judiciary. So the judges abide by the rules of court that are issued by the Oklahoma Supreme Court. The decisions of the Court of Land Tenure can be appealed up into the Supreme Court process. Okay, so end of slide 2. Let's go to slide 3 if we can. Prepare your work outside. Get everything ready for yourself in the field. And after that, build your house. Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors, they succeed. We have now given the land back to Philippines. How are they going to use the land? There's 2 chapters in the code that deal with that. And the most important is chapter 1 of Title 41. And it creates the Land Use and Planning and Zoning Commission. And this was done about 30 years ago, 30 years ago. And it was put into the code after a lot of study. There were groups that went to Hawaii and sat down with the Department of Land, the zoning commissions and such in Hawaii and Guam. And it was basically an American concept. Planning and zoning is that you don't have a fiberglass boat building factory right next to houses, because all the grinding and all the pollution that comes out of one of those industries, you don't want it to be drifting into your child's rooms and such like that. So the American concept of zoning is that you zone certain areas for residential, you zone certain areas for commercial, certain areas for industrial, other areas you reserve for wildlands and watersheds and such like that. The Zoning Commission was created with a lot of hoopla, a lot of excitement. The commissioners were appointed, but something sad happened. Land planning and land zoning is not a subject that's familiar within your own customs and operations. And pretty soon the Land Zoning Commission was playing Board of Trustees and promising people to give them land. Seriously. You're just supposed to say how you use your land, not who gets the land. So, we hired a consultant. There was an Australian consultant come in to do a total land planning. How we're going to
to plan out the whole island, where the schools would be, where the dispensaries would be, and all that. And we got some pretty expensive pictures and maps drawn, but it all fell by the wayside. That chapter today is dead. The governor had not submitted the nomination for a single member of that land planning commission. Okay. Then after Pohnpei's first invitation to visit China, this was under the administration of Johnny David Part 1, his first term in office. We were brought to sites in China where they dedicated certain parcels of land they call development zones. Those development zones would not pay import taxes, export taxes. They were there critically to create industry. All the buildings were built by the government or sanctioned by the government. All kinds of tax breaks were made and everything. And the whole idea of a land development zone is to accelerate economic development. This was done in the days of the ADB and the World Bank that was saying, you need to privatize everything. Economic development and world trade is the most important thing that will secure your future. So in that atmosphere, 2 development zones were established. One on the east side of the Gadget Causeway and one on the west side of the Gadget Causeway. Now the development zones, as they were set up in the law, had all kinds of organizational provisions. There was going to be an organizational group that would plan out the zone, divide up the zone, decide what kinds of industries would come in and all that type of thing. And it was all patterned after the Chinese example. They had huge factories going on in their development zones, huge centers of industry. We had a few companies who had a little bit of interest, but no ever any serious interest. And that was a failure. If you look on the causeway, there are leases out there, but none of those leases were issued in accordance with the development zones that were supposed to be totally integrated and totally controlled by a management group. That just didn't exist. So, slide plan community with respect to Pohnpei is basically a total failure. Let's go to the next slide. Land is my security. And you will feel secure because there is hope. You will look around and take your rest in security. But the wicked borrows, but does not pay back. The righteous is generous and gives. We started our land is my security with mortgages. And the law of mortgages started in Isla Nankin's office in the old American Banking and Savings and Loan business downstairs in the white building below us. He was the bank manager for American Savings and Loan. He said, we need mortgage laws so I can make loans. So the 2 of us started to work on the mortgage concept. By the time we were finished, we brought in vice presidents of the Bank of Hawaii and comparable people from the Bank of Hawaii. And essentially, we went to the banks and said, all right, banks, tell us how you want the mortgage law to look. You're the ones that are going to make the mortgage law, the mortgage loans. So basically, our mortgage law is a law that was created at the request and with the input of the 3 banks that were doing business in Pohnpei at the time. You're smiling because you remember those days. All right. There was one thing that we put in that law that was championed by the Micronesian Legal Services. It's called the right of redemption. I don't know if it's ever been utilized, but the legislature was saying mortgages and putting up your land as a security for a loan for economic development. We don't know if this chicken farm's going to make it, or if this pepper farm's going to make it, or this car rental's going to make it. But my land is now at stake. Now, when they're dealing with the FSM Development Bank or one of the commercial banks or the Small Business Guarantee Loan, they're all excited about getting the money. Find the bottom, okay. Now they've committed their land. And the wicked don't pay their lands back. We have a lot of defaults. We watched the founding fathers, the early senators in trust territory times. They made the first government loan programs. They got their first loans, they didn't pay them back, and all of a sudden the loans disappeared. That didn't happen with the FSM Development Bank. So the right of redemption was brought in here so the family could get together and say, all right, my oldest brother lost our land. Let's all get together, pool our resources, and get by that land back. So that was put in to the Pohnpei Code. Banks screaming all the way. They did not like that at all, but that's in there. All right. The second land is my security is Chapter 7, Deeds of Trust. And this started with the Farmers Home Administration. Now they call it Rural Development. And they were going to make loans available to Pohnpei. They were going to set up an office here. But they needed a security law as well. I said, well, we've got the mortgage law. No, we can't deal with that. Why? Because our rules and regulations, federal rules and regulations, say you have to have a deed of trust. That's the only way Farmers Home would work. Now, there is a difference between a mortgage and a deed of trust, and it's this. In a mortgage, I own the land, you're the bank, I promise that I will let the court sell my land in a foreclosure sale if I default on the loan. You get a promise, that's it. And you take the promise to the court and say, that landowner put up his land, he promised that you would sell it. And the court issues the foreclosure documents and they put it up for sale under the court's ruling, under the court's guidance. It is a court-ordered sale. A deed of trust is something different. In a deed of trust, I need your loan. I convey my ownership to you, but with the condition you can only hold it. You can't utilize that land, but you can only hold it until I pay my debt back. So in a deed of trust, you're actually conveying the ownership of land to the agency or the entity you're borrowing the loan from, you're borrowing the money from. So we went to Washington. We sat down with Farmers Home. We said, we can't do that in Parliament. Why? It violates the Pohnpei Constitution. The United States government is not a citizen of Pohnpei. And only Bulldogs can own land in Pohnpei. So everybody scratches their heads. We can't go forward. The Farmers Home says we can't make exceptions to one little island in the Pacific for our national regulations. You either abide by our rules or you don't get Farmers Home loans. Worked on it, worked on it, worked on it. Here comes the Housing Authority. The Housing Authority is a creature of Pohnpei law. The board of directors of the Housing Authority are all Pohnpei. Okay. We're going to make this loan. We're going to give the deed of trust not to Farmers Home, but to the Pohnpei Housing Authority. Now, if the individual landowner defaults, Housing authority, your responsibility is to get that money from that landowner or sell his land. Because you are now the owner of the land, and you will sell the land to pay off the debt. Now, housing authority, the money you get from that sale, you give to Farmers Home. But Farmers Home is stingy. We're not satisfied with just the proceeds from the sale. You have to guarantee repayment of the entire debt. If the debt is for $100,000 and you only get $50,000 from the sale, housing authority, you take it out of your own revenues and give it to Farmers Home Administration, the other $50,000. So in order to make this work, between the Farmers Home and the Board of the Housing Authority, they established what they call an escrow account. An escrow account is a holding account in the bank that if the foreclosure sale does not match the amount due, they reach into the escrow account, pull out the balance, and provide the full default amount to Governmental Administration, now Rural Development. That worked fine in the beginning. The problem is that the loans started to exceed how much money was available in the escrow account. The escrow account didn't keep up with the liability of the loans. And about 5 years ago, we were in a crisis with the Farmers Home Administration because the Farmers Housing Authority could not meet their obligations. That may be still, from the auditor's office, that may still be part of the problem. So we've been looking at solutions like a certain percentage of the loan must go into the escrow account so we keep the escrow account solvent. But solutions have not been added to the code yet. When I started out, I said, the law of land is like 100 years is like a day. So we reach back, the law of land is as old as civilization itself. But the land law is also very dynamic. As I said also, we've been amending the titles on land more than any other titles in the code. So when the Housing Authority, the Department of Land, the Board of Trustees runs into these problems, that's the time to approach the legislature with solutions. How are we going to deal with this problem? The escrow account remains as a problem in the deed of trust law. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Next land is called the gift of land. Given it will be given unto you. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes or others will be refreshed. Among the trust territory, especially the Federated States of the United Nations, Pohnpei stands out as owning more public land than anybody else. Huge parcels of public land. And there's all kinds of entities and parties that want to make use of those lands. So probably our most active chapter in all of the Pohnpei Code, the more bills that are enacted into law end up in chapter 10 of Title 42. We got more than 170 sections in there now. And in that law, we're making land available for churches, all kinds of things. We have satellite, laterite for making bricks, rice mills, Head Start programs, staff housing for the national government, lands for community houses for the outer islands, lands for our church schools, Salvation Army, Catholic, stuff like that. These are gifts of land that was made by the state government to what the legislature felt were deserving entities to receive that. Nathalie wants to build a waste treatment site so they don't pile up all the land, all the garbage in their backyard. So we designate a certain public land to Nathalie to create that. All these things are constantly being brought before the legislature. We need land to build a radio station, religious radio station, such like that. In these situations, what occurs is the entity will approach the state government and basically the legislature, the members of the legislature review the merits of the request. And if they like that, they authorize the Public Lands Board of Trustees to lease that land out or convey that land out to these worthy causes. And that's what you see in Chapter 10 of Title 42 of the Code. We've come to a problem, well, I guess a different issue. So that is, you just have to look at Chapter 10 and you'll see all the various reasons why land has been donated. And it is as wide as the open. But just curse your way through Chapter 10 and you'll see all those. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Development is my goal. Oh, wait, are we missing one? Development is my goal is the next one. Do you have that? Uh-oh, your report doesn't have it. All right, look on your sheet. I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. Codex 1980s, 1990s, UN Indicative Development Bank, UNDP, Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, were all coming after Panama. And they said, you need economic development to end the trust territory to create a viable nation, and land is standing in the way. You need to make your land available for economic development or you won't survive as a state or a nation. So, they wanted to do land ownership. They wanted to allow non-citizens to be able to own land in Philippines. That violates the Philippine Constitution. More importantly, it violates almost every Philippine sense of land ownership. We needed to do something else. The Constitution limits leases of land to 25 years, unless extended by statute. And that's where we began discussions with Asian Development Bank, World Bank, and the rest. What term of lease would make economic development possible? Palau went full blast. They said 100-year leases. They went into court and the court said, the Palau Supreme Court said, 100-year lease is like ownership. We're not going to allow that. We worked on this, the members worked on this for quite some time. We even went up to SICA and looked at their leasing laws. And their leasing laws was 55 years. He said, why did you settle on 55 years? And what the private attorneys that were working with the developers told us is this. The big hotels were coming in under the Japanese bubble. They figured their hotel will have a life expectancy of about 25 years. After that, they're going to have to do a major rehaul of the entire facility if it's going to maintain a 5-star status. So they set 55 years as enough in order to allow the developers to come in. They can get their investment paid back well before half a century is concluded. So 5-year maps. But we also were receiving reports from the Department of Land and the legislators in Hawaii, parts of the APIL stuff. They said, be careful with your outside interests who want to possess Ponape property. And Marcelino, you may know this from your time with Dr. Dater. He was cautioning us that there's a lot of land speculation. People come in to acquire land, not to develop it, but just to get it at a low price, turn around and sell it at a high price. Land speculation. And he said that creates no benefit for the state of Hawaii at all. So we put something into the 55-year development leasehold act, which is your number one on development is about goal, that you must put development. You must actually develop the land within the first 5 years, or you lose your 5 years, or whatever. And then over time we modified that. You could go from 25 years all the way up to 55 years, depending about the amount of money that you would invest in the land. If you invested $100,000 or $200,000, you would get to 30 years or more, you get to the next level, the next level. So that's tiered into the legislation now. But the caveat is that after 5 years, you made all these promises when you got the lease. But if you don't fulfill your development promises, your lease converts back to 25. You lose your extended leases unless you actually develop the land. And that is the prime difference between using land as development in the American concept where everybody can speculate. In the Ponape concept, if you're going to come in and get a long-term lease, you're going to have to really develop that land and turn it into an economic machine. And that's the law that started out and it's still the law today. We've also looked at land as generating revenues and other concepts which are localized. Chapter 8 of Title 42, we're allowing the owners of shorelines to develop into the title area in front of their land. And each one is controlled by a statute. The first one was the Mangrove Bay, right down there, and then we have some gas stations and others around the island. And this is done by statute. They come in and they request, we want to develop the shoreline of our properties because we're going to do this project, economic project, or that economic project. That's reviewed, and if it passes muster, then the Board of Trustees of Public Lands is authorized to lease that land out for that development project along the shoreline. Probably the most controversial one is our mining and dredging law. We have sites all over Ponape that are designated in the law for mining and dredging. And we issue 2 types of permits on mining and dredging. The company that's going to engage in the mining and dredging, or the person or company, and 2, the company that actually brings in their plows and shovels and scoopers and all of that. And each of those 2 parties have different rules under the mining and dredging. In the mining and dredging law, we have what we call royalties. When a dredging company pulls out coral and sells it to you, they're making money. Part of that money needs to be paid back to the Board of Trustees, back to the Ponape Lands Trust. That is taking public land for private use and they're buying it. So we have a royalty, it's called royalty. We have a royalty so much per cubic yard of all the lands that are taken out in development along the submerged lands for mining and dredging. A lot of times we make an exception where a developer is making a boat channel and he's going to use the rest of the dredge just to make a shoreline embankment or something like that. If they leave the dredge material on the dredge site, utilize it there, a lot of times the royalty fee is forgiven. But for those commercial dredgers who are in the business of dredging and selling, there are permits that need to be acquired and there are royalty fees that need to be paid. All right, the next one, what we call government leases for economic development and public service. This is a new one. It's just been added in the last year or so. And what we're doing with this one is, this started out with the old fisheries corporation on the Ketchikan Port Authority. Lou and Ty has taken over what was once a public corporation, the Pohnpei Fisheries Corporation, and they turned it into a private business. All right. The idea, at first it was going to be part of the public lands, but because of the magnitude of it and the fees and such that were involved, a decision was made that these leases would be made by the state government rather than the Board of Trustees. And then the state government would have greater control on these. That has recently been expanded for all the telecom sites. So the telecom sites comes under this chapter of the law as well. And these are basically targeted as large developments of the land, very costly development. All right. The last one we call the Omnibus Development Statute. And this is arisen from proposals that have been submitted to the Pohnpei government of building casinos, large resorts, golf courses, such like that. And we're looking at proposals like to create a casino golf course. And we know that our environmental protection laws are not up to the level of controlling these very intensive uses of land. So we borrowed a concept from Hawaii, they shared with us, to come up with an omnibus development statute. If a large hotel casino corporation wants to come in and take over Lukau, the entire area, they would be accorded a special lease, which would come under what we call the Omnibus Development Statute. But there would be special rules on environment, special rules on use, special rules on development, all written exclusively for large-scale tourism developments that doesn't have any semblance of reality for the rest of Pohnpei. That was set in when we were getting these large proposals for these huge developments. It's never been implemented, but it's in the law. If the casinos, during the last administration, not Governor Reed's, but under Pangilinan administration, we were getting some fairly large casino proposals coming in. Okay, so that's a chapter we can't see on that thing. All right, the next chapter that you can't see, but you'll have to look at your handout, is the needs of our government. And that's chapter 11 of the code. Now remember, going all the way back to this slide on the creation of the Public Lands Authority, and now the Board of Trustees. When the trust territory wanted to withhold the 800 acres, and we said, no, we're going to make an entity entirely separate of the government to hold the public lands. They hold in trust for the benefit of the Pampanga people, not of the Pohnpei government, of each one of you as individual, ordinary citizens. All right. So once we made that conveyance over to the Board of Trustees, there goes this building and all the buildings and all the development that run the Pohnpei government. The legislature here, the schools, the dispensaries, the hospitals. Chapter 11 was created for the Board of Trustees to convey back to the Pohnpei government those pieces of land that the Pohnpei government actively used. We use the example of our donation of land to the national capital. The government of Pohnpei actually has to use the land. They can't just grab and hold. No squandering. If you're going to get land, you've got to show. There's a school there, there's a dispensary there, there's the administration building there. And those lands under Chapter 11 are conveyed to the Pohnpei government. But it's a conditional conveyance. Condition meaning as long as you use it for a public purpose. As long as you're using it for the state purposes. These are needed to run the governor's office upstairs, the legislature next door, the judiciary across the street. As long as the government, just like the rules for the national government, as long as you're using it for government purposes, it's yours. But as soon as you abandon it, it comes back to the public trust. Now, this is what the brand new law on the fixed retention area is about. That land is no longer used by the government because you don't have men white teachers anymore. All those houses have been squatted in. Let's get that back to the Lands Authority, the Board of Trustees, and let them lease it out under the rules and regulations that we have for all the public lands. All right. So when we're looking at that, Chapter 11 dedicates the land to the state government with the caveat that if you don't need it anymore, give it back to the Board of Trustees because they need that land to give it out for residences and businesses and stuff like that. This works everywhere except right across the street. We have a Red Cross in an old ex-guy house. Now, we have land for the Olympics Committee, we have land for all these things, but there's never been a designation of that house for the Red Cross. Something the administration should do. And this is where Pohnpei law differs from every other state in the FSM. We have public lands, a public lands trust that's controlled by a Board of Trustees. That Board of Trustees is independent of the government and how they operate, except for certain controls on how they lease land and the governor has to do this and that. But basically, we separate the trust from the government. When the government ceases to use a piece of land, the governor can't give it away. His obligation is to return that land to the trust. Return it to the people. Because the government doesn't need it anymore. The government is a lessee just like any of the commercial operations you see on Main Street. Okay? So, this is a continuing review that's going on. What land is actually used by the state government? We use the same format we use for the national government when we put Chapter 11 together. Land that you're using right now, what a little bit of growth. If you're going to need it in the next 5 years, you can hold on to it. But if you're not using it, fixed retention area, give it back to the Board of Trustees. They need to get that out to the people. Okay. All right, so we turn from the missing slide to, yeah, that's it, okay. We have 3 more things I just added here. When we say the needs of our government, it's not only the state government. We're part of the Federated States of Micronesia. You're not only a Pohnpei citizen, you're an episode citizen as well. So we can treat the land in Palaker that we gave to the national government. I included the College of Micronesia. That was a major land grant. Pohnpei donated to the college itself with the idea, with the knowledge that the college is controlled by a national statute, but this is Pohnpei's commitment. We're part of the nation. We have to educate our kids. And then we have, as the host of the national capital, we have some obligation to recognize their international obligations. Okay? So we have provisions in our code for embassies. Now, the maximum lease we have for a private commercial operation, like a new hotel or something, is 5 years. For embassies, that bar is raised to 100 years because of the permanent nature of our relations with the world, with the nations of the world. We also look at the FSM's international commitments in other areas. And so the Pacific Tuna Commission is a prime example where the state of Pohnpei, well, the legislature directed the Board of Trustees to lease out, long-term lease, the land where the old discount office was, the old hospital was, to the Tuna Commission, because we understand our obligations in the international community. The most recent is there is a new UN ambassador who is located in Pohnpei. This is the new Center for North Pacific Affairs for the United Nations. And he's looking for a place to situate his office. So he's come to the state government asking for a piece of land. But his idea is he's going to make that land as an open source land for museum and cultural exchange. So one idea is the old agriculture station, but the sense is that we should leave it up to the UN ambassador himself to figure out where he wants to put his site. Maybe near Navigal with the Nation City or something like that. He's very much committed to creating an image for the United Nations that has meaning, not only for Pohnpei, but not only for the FSM, but for the entire North Pacific that he represents. So, the Chapter 11 is what we do for the state government. That's our schools, our dispensaries, the administration buildings, our judicial facilities, such like that. And then in Chapter 10, we see, in other chapters, we see other areas that we are addressing the needs of the national governments and the municipal governments as well. All right, so our final slide, we'll go to over the horizon, that's your last page. Do you have that? Yeah. All right. One of my mother's favorite quotes. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. What do we do from now on? 2023 is right around the corner. We have no idea how that is being put together. So I think you're part of that effort. But in Compact 1, when Pohnpei had walked away from the concept of free association, there was huge effort to bring Pohnpei into the negotiating process. Compact 2, the states were basically just let down. Compact 3 is in negotiations now. And if the policy leaders of Pohnpei really want to be involved with what Compact 3 is going to look like, you need yourself to step forward. The Congress is not going to offer it. You're going to have to come forward and establish your own platform or whatever. Now, outside of the challenges of what happens in 2023 and beyond, that's mostly government and international relations. Something that Mr. Kohler will bring up pretty soon, historic land trust is something in the works. Namadol has been designated as a World Heritage Site. But more important than that, it's been designated as a World Heritage Site in danger. So the legislature's been working with historic preservation at the national level to create what we would call a historic land trust. Don't want to create it as a government again, because this is not about the current government. This is about the culture and traditions of Pohnpei and the Senevian Empire that stretched from Pohnpei and Australia all the way to Yap, all centered out of Namadol. So, as we put this land trust legislation, and Ercolano can walk you through the precepts of it, there's an effort to anchor it in the traditions of Pohnpei, throughout this time, so we have traditional leaders on the board of trustees and so on, in the legislation that's being developed. But our consultants from abroad say, well, your board of trustees, you're trying to reach down and make your connection with your history, with the culture, with your tradition. But Namadol needs to be run as a business as well. You need managers who know how to get grant monies and deal with the World Heritage Foundation at the international level. So they're recognizing that, they're suggesting that we do a tier level of organization for Namadol. We have a board of trustees, they all have to be Pohnpeian, deep traditional groups, but we also have a board of directors or board of managers, which you could bring in archaeologists, anthropologists, leaders in the field that don't necessarily have to be Pohnpeian, but have the ability and the connections to reach to the international grants that would make that entity viable, that historic trust viable. We're also looking at another concept that we call community land trust, and this is centered on the Kapingi village in Tarakia. In our lease to conveyance statutes, I think it's chapter 3, where we have the Navy and Japanese leases. We did a special provision for a PAM called MAC out in Natalini, the Pingmapis community. In that community, we allowed them to divide up their village into individual land plots, connected to their agricultural plots, and convey land across. Community land trust is a little different. It's where an ethnic group wants to keep their identity as an ethnic group. So, and this is, this would be a decision that would be made by the Kapingi Marangi people living in the Parakiat village. If they want to maintain that village concept, that mutual ownership, then the board of trustees from the major trust, the Pohnpei Trust, would convey that village down to another layer of trust we would call the Kapingi Marangi Village Trust, Community Land Trust. And their responsibility then would be to assign lots to different individuals, where they want the handicraft shops, where they want their community house, where they want their houses of worship and stuff like that. That would be controlled by a board of trustees for that specific provision of land. It's not a government entity. They're not passing laws or anything. They are just managing the land collectively on behalf of the residents. And the community land trust concept in this relationship would be, if you're going to move into the Kapingi village, if you're going to get rights within the village, you have to have an ethnic tie to the village. Now, if this works for Kapingi, we're looking at maybe doing the same thing for Nakuru and other of the outer islands as sea rises and they lose their land. And they have to find safe havens on promontories. Do we want to give them individual plots? Or do you want to create villages that are very similar to the outer island villages down by the waterfront where they can have their canoes or boathouses and their meeting houses and stuff like that? This is something that is over the horizon. It's not a law, but these are things that the policy makers of today are looking at. What are we going to do in the future? The community land trust is also, I just mentioned the safe havens. We have a legislation for the last 2 terms of the legislature to address global warming. As the waters rise and flood out the outer islands and they lose their homes, what as a state do we do to take care of it? These are concepts that the water is rising but very slowly. They're not going to lose their atoll while we're alive. But we're looking to the future, how things are going. Put a lot of lines under that on your page because you guys have lots of ideas of how you want land law to go as well. In the beginning, I said land law is as old as civilization, but I also said land law and politics can change all the time. It's a very, very dynamic part of the law, and it's the most active part of our code. Okay, thank you, gentlemen and ladies.
Can you just elaborate? Currently, the Code of Land Tenure is authorized to designate and register Navy and Japanese seamen. Who should be conducting the first hearing? Should the board conduct the first hearing of those claims? Or is it the Code of Land Tenure?
Judah, are you going to bring this up in your lease law? Director, my talk this morning was, the broad overstroke, and we have individual presenters. Attorney Giuliani is going to address the lease laws, and his office is involved in that area of it. We just made the rules up here. You guys have to carry it out. So with your permission, I'd like to turn that question over to Giuliani. We have it in the book if you want to try to find it. All right, for the rest of the presenters, I took the liberty of
to open up American Savings and Loan Association. At that time, Panchay Umaliakas, Delton, Nathan Boy. American Savings and Loan Association, someone not tell you, Mr. Only building residential homes. Peter. Rajon Besela Group, sort of mortgage law, men. The talk young AG at that time, legal counsel, legislature. Isang sapat ako, another mo kawata dyan kasakal, hindi daw buko. Believe we run the user element. At the user element, tam kakiyang tulong, presentation. While the international community presentation, so with Congress, I was working with Senator Elias Thomas. So we are chairman and finance committee, all user element. Nanti Murisong Riau, remove from Isaac Riau, Potato and Isaac. Headquarters and American. Wow, Charma, let's start. Mortgage of it, Nana to go to Pinuma. As he said, we work with lawyers, Bank of Hawaii, and our American citizens. Our Coco to my son, Tamu Yau, Mato Resign. We have collected about $3.6 million some money saving. Total collection at that time. Total loan you hold. Weki, Aranana, and Utah, mortgage law, usually the good one. And we say that Sapogia has a John Bennett, that was a big question. Immense challenge. My vodka na melon. Tayo mga sa Malaro, we did a performance audit compliance on government residential homes. Sino ka naman may mami ito? Karaniang kampi na ito. And to me, when raised, when we are challenging yung kumain. Ano ba? Housing area, the Patropix. Sangatapix, Kokotala, government housing state. Pag-isang kabina, Marcelo, Wimo, and assign them sa matay losing of kabina. Legislator, katkita katawan namun, when renovating ko pas, kaya team, sinisya kriyaw magbihasa. Nan mo'y kapana chonesa, amen ewan ko kisola chogo. Akin instruct amen etwal kapana amen arabes ko house city. I-find them with uyan natin. Arabes ko santiang nanin ko nukira pe ko siyang ko. Saranga ko di. This is a very important priority. There's a Patawata money for a renovate team ko. To tell them find this housing on supplementary come and employ man. Very expensive. Contractor na alam money or TNI kaya. Kung kayo mingo kaya, hindi na tamay kamo niya. Imoy na siya queen. Chota mo yung manaman. Hey! May kaya politik. Imo kato, may kili man government, ito nga chunta tao, kaya may chunta pa katuti. Ngayon na tayo, manili. Marcelo, titin, perfect. So, ang siyo may rendering ba ito, may wala rendering. Pero hindi, wala naman fix. Uyin na, naipuran mo siya. So, sino kasi kaya mo? Sino ka raw may katuwa? We rai mata wire betano uyaw siyang ito peksa pos koko talas mino kang ito daratan man kita mo sa paray ay jodoh ko lang yun jodoh sa patukar sa pangkeleti utara kang ito walang siya tasya nga pero front of me ay Jugiyang Marcelo Jugiyang priority at may kanaya Tame imunapya ko chorus was I did a comprehensive report of what happened. Police was investigating some of it. Manda siyang rano, all no yapya warturi. Wala nga nata siya. Asiwa ito ang lupso ng kato. Danan, Iman ka na siya mag-ausig kasi, kano ba ni? Ako na ang short packing ka siya buwan. Short ka siya katanong kasi. Gagasya ta, dahil siya gusto ka na. Right? Apa guru tanam meron siya ka na. What? Pinubuha ko siya, siyong ko po nga. Kamasyan kaya natin. Siya damo daw na. Kami katuan kita sa actual experience of public land. I wrote a report. Ang mga kagabnanaso, kagabnaraw ito kumay. Ananakan Gonpei State Government and Kosameti the actual land need for Gonpei State and the next 4 years. Dua oras mag-test na ba namin? Listen. That is my recommendation. Parang namin ito. Yung may pakita ko sa renovated, muli ko ako rin siya mapat-patwata na kailangan na next year. Look eh, mukha ko ang renovate. Kupur matamatawan mo yung sulpi ramo naman. Amo, ime may share kisang may presentation ramo. Kanaanan ka mo eh. Kaya tingin niya nga pag-uhutan, patapatuloy siyang kasinatan. Ranana kami, pansalan, karakter, kaya nagpapulan. Why not identify? Work will come with the legislation. Possibility, sa umuwan public land, yawa siya nananay ka. Dua ko mataysuda namin. In my opinion, it's time that we call, not more than 3-4 stores. Rather than spreading. May kapra na ang haramas. That is my recommendation. Bex, kakaya pa siya kariyaw siguro. Last one. Okay. Nakasuda na, kaputula. Kaya na siyang niyang lala. O, yan na. Kailangan na.
Naman, dahil kaya rason sa panatinso. So, man pagkita ka dahil ang kakin sa ulan ko na on lunch. Naman ba, let's visit ang presentation ka, utahan siya ba ang kakin na kita.